Good morning, government class. It is Monday, April 27th, and this week we're going to be talking about the national security setup in the United States. One thing to remember is that 9/11, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, really changed how we approach national security in this country and really increased the number of agencies and people involved in national security and things like that with the creation of the Homeland Security Department and everything. A lot of laws were passed then, a number of them curtailing quite a few freedoms, which is a discussion that would be worthwhile having. How much freedom do you give up in order to gain some security? But anyway, today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Defense Department. This used to be called, up until I believe around the time of World War II, the War Department. Department of War, which is an accurate description of what it is. It has to do with the military. But it's worth thinking about why they would have changed it from the War Department to the Department of Defense. Is that something that, Department of Defense sounds better than the War Department, maybe less threatening or less warmongering? It's worthwhile thinking about. So anyway, the Defense Department, Congress established what is today called the Department of Defense, or DoD, in the National Security Act of 1947. Yeah, so World War II. It is the present-day successor to two historic cabinet-level agencies: the War Department, created by Congress in 1789, and the Navy Department, created in 1798. Congress created the Defense Department in order to unify the nation's armed forces. It wished to then bring the then separate Army, including the Air Force, and the Navy under the control of a single cabinet department. Today, there are nearly 1.4 million men and women on active duty in the military, over 1 million in the National Guard and Reserves, and some 650,000 civilians employed by the Defense Department. So if you think about it, you have the Army and the Navy. Up until after World War II, the Air Force was considered part of the Army. It was the Army Air Forces. So the Air Force wasn't a separate branch of the military service. And the Marines, you may be wondering where the Marines come in. The Marines have always been part of the Navy. So they're under the Navy Department. Okay, civil control of the military. This is going to be an essential question for this week. Why do we have civilian control of the military? The authors of the Constitution understood the importance of the nation's defense. They emphasized that fact clearly in the preamble, and they underscored it in the body of the Constitution by mentioning defense more frequently than any other government function. It's kind of the primary function of government, really, is to protect the country from outside and inside malign forces. The framers also recognized the dangers inherent in military power and the potential of its abuse. They knew that its very existence can pose a threat to free government, which has been shown throughout history. People come into office with bad intent, they control the military, and all of a sudden you've got the military exerting control over the internal populace of a country, which is not good, and which is specifically banned in the Constitution. They're not allowed to do that. And therefore, the Constitution is studded with provisions to make sure that the military is always subject to the control of the nation's civilian authorities. Thus, the Constitution makes the elected president the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. To the same end, it gives broad military powers to Congress, that is, to the elected representatives of the people. So there have been, obviously, there have been a lot of presidents and other elected officials who have been in the military. Um, that's been a fairly common thing, although the last several presidents have not had military experience. But it is certainly not a requirement that in order to be elected president or any other office that you would have had to have served in the military. Although that is a pretty strong, still a pretty strong recommendation for someone going into office. And it's a good way to get out votes. Someone who's been in the military, if there is a veteran running for office, you can be pretty sure that you're going to see a lot of pictures or videos of them in uniform or discharging their military duties. The principle of civilian control has always been a major factor in the making of defense policy, and in the creation and staffing of the various agencies responsible for the execution of that policy. The importance of civilian control is clearly illustrated by this fact. The National Security Act of 1947 provides that the Secretary of Defense cannot have served on active duty in any of the armed forces for at least 10 years before being named to that post. So this is a cabinet level position, the Secretary of Defense. This is the president's main go-to person for military advice. Cannot have served in the active duty military for 10 years before being appointed as Secretary of Defense. So that just enhances that principle of civilian control of the military. Okay, the Department of Defense is headed by the Secretary of Defense, whose appointment by the President is subject to confirmation by the Senate. The Secretary, who serves at the President's pleasure, is charged with two major responsibilities. He or she, there's no requirement that it be a man, he is simultaneously, one, the President's chief aide and advisor in making and carrying out defense policy, and two, the operating head of the Defense Department. The Secretary's huge domain is often called the Pentagon because of its massive five-sided headquarters building in Virginia, across the Potomac River from the Capitol. Its operations have regularly taken a large slice of the federal budget every year for more than 70 years, and about a fifth of all federal spending today. So that's 20% of all federal spending. And federal spending is trillions and trillions of dollars. A fifth of that, 20% of that, goes to the Department of Defense. The global war on terrorism has forced vast increases in expenditures for the military. The Department of Defense spent nearly $300 billion in fiscal year 2001, the year of the September 11th attacks. It will almost certainly spend well over twice that amount in fiscal year 2013. Okay, so this book, remember, is about 7 years old, and it's very interesting to note that just in those 7 years since this book was written and published, the challenges to the United States have really changed quite a bit. The military has recognized that there is a much greater danger, finally recognized that there's a much greater danger from climate change to the country, to the military itself, than it at least admitted in 2013. And then, of course, with a pandemic going on now and the likelihood that we're not going to see the end of this anytime soon, there's going to be a big military, I'm sure there's tons of military planning going on and military spending in terms of the pandemic. And of course, you've also got situations where there are ships at sea where the coronavirus has begun running rampant through the sailors on board. And when you're on a ship, there's no way to socially distance from anyone else. So if one person has it, it's going to run like wildfire through a ship. So this is another thing that the military is having to deal with and having to spend a lot of money on too. Okay. The 6 members, so we talked about chief military aides. The 6 members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff serve as the principal military advisors to the Secretary of Defense and to the President and the National Security Council. This collective body is made up of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the vice chairman, the Army Chief of Staff, Chief of Naval Operations, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and the Air Force Chief of Staff. So this is the currently serving military heads. These are all going to be high-ranking generals of all branches of the armed forces. The highest-ranking uniformed officers in the armed services, the members of the Joint Chiefs, are named by the President, subject to Senate approval. So this is, again, the President, as Commander-in-Chief, has the constitutional right to say, I want these people as members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. But, at least in theory, those appointments of different people are required to go to Congress, to the Senate, to be approved. And without that Senate approval, those members are not supposed to be serving as Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, again, under the Trump administration, what we've had a lot of, and I'm not sure that any of the current Joint Chiefs are this way, but what we've had a lot of is that a lot of positions that are required by the Constitution to have Senate approval or confirmation have been instead filled with people who are serving what's called an acting role. acting secretary of whatever, which just means that the president is bypassing the section of the Constitution that requires Senate approval for these positions, which is not how things are supposed to go, but has been for the last 3.5 years how things have been working. So anyway, all right, tomorrow we're going to get into the military departments themselves, the Army, Navy, etc. And then we'll be talking on Wednesday about the Director of National Intelligence and the Department of Homeland Security. If anyone's gotten on a plane recently, of course, not a whole lot of people are doing any flying now, but if you've gotten on a plane recently, you've had to go through all the security checks, and you've had direct experience with the Department of Homeland Security. Anyway, I hope you all are having a good day, and we'll be back tomorrow with more videos. Bye-bye.